Hello, and welcome to another episode of Virtual Legality. I'm your host, Richard Hoeg, managing member of the Hoeg Law business law firm of Northville, Michigan. And we're coming to you today with a follow-up episode to a video we recently did in Virtual Legality entitled We Do Not Accept, which was all about how Visa, Mastercard, and other payment processors may or may not be requiring video game providers like Steam and itch.io to remove content that is otherwise legal in the jurisdictions in which they operate from their services at the request of either activists or the payment processors themselves. Now, this is a follow-up because things have changed since we made that video, but it is not the end of the story by any means, so please stay tuned to the end of this video for things that I think we can still keep doing on this very important story in the world of video gaming and beyond. So thank you for joining me today in Virtual Legality, and if you like content like this, please consider supporting us through our Patreon, memberships and super chats on our live streams, or otherwise, as we found with the first video here, since we are going to be saying words that YouTube does not like, and certainly in the context of defending freedom of expression and First Amendment law in the United States, we're not going to be self-censoring for the words that YouTube doesn't like, leaving comments to this video. If you've got comments, if you've got concerns, things I got right, things I got wrong, that seems to really be helping videos like this one get out there into the YouTube ecosystem, or the podcast ecosystem if you're listening to this later on. And if you could comment on it, I would really, really appreciate it. So thank you for that. And now we can get on with the substance of our video. So first, just in summary of what we've been talking about in our prior video and now, I wanted to give you a 30,000-foot overview of what's happening. So here's The Guardian saying, why did thousands of adult titles just disappear from the biggest PC gaming marketplaces? Digital distribution platforms Steam and itch.io have tightened their rules about adult content under pressure from payment processors. Why has this happened, and where will it lead? So this article says, payment processors such as Mastercard, Visa, and PayPal are behind all this. They then say the rules that were established after a campaign by the organization Collective Shout, which we talked about in our prior video, urged payment processors to stop facilitating payments to platforms hosting rape, incest, and child sexual abuse themed games. And you can see why I just mentioned YouTube's not going to love anything I have to say in this video, so everything you can do to get messages like this one out there is very much appreciated. How did this start? On 16 July, Valve, the developer of Steam, updated its rules and guidelines regarding the games and software that can be distributed on the platform. The rules, which already prohibited, and this is important, nude or sexually explicit images of real people and adult content that isn't appropriately labeled or age-gated, as well as things that are just illegal on their face, were expanded to include content that may violate the rules and standards set forth by Steam's payment processors. And we commented on that in the earlier video, that this may violate is entirely opaque and almost impossible to align yourself with if you're on the developer side, let alone the Steam side. But as this story has continued, we can start to see why Valve didn't make any more strong a statement here and just provided all this flexibility for themselves to say this particular piece of software doesn't comply, because they don't appear to know what complies or doesn't comply any more than we do. And so that's a part of this story, absolutely. A week later, itch.io issued a statement explaining it had also come under scrutiny from payment processors. Unlike Valve, Itch specifically referenced Collective Shout as the cause of the renewed scrutiny. In April, this group, Collective Shout, successfully petitioned to have the game No Mercy removed from Steam and itch.io. After this, the group published an open letter to payment processors claiming to have discovered hundreds of other games featuring rape, incest, and child sexual abuse on both Steam and itch.io. And as I said in my prior video, no one wants to be seen as defending these things. These are quote-unquote icky topics for anybody. That is how censorship starts. That's why I'm making this video and the video like it beforehand, because this is very important to me, and I think it should be important to anybody that wants to experience media, books, videos, video games, television, movies, whatever you want to think of it as, in a way that goes without censorship by corporations like Mastercard and Visa. And they request payment processors demonstrate corporate social responsibility, this is Collective Shout speaking now, and immediately cease processing payments on Steam and itch.io. After Steam altered its rules, Collective Shout claimed credit for the change, stating that more than 1,000 of its supporters had called or emailed payment processors to make their demands. Now, like many other online retailers, Steam and Itch rely on payment processors to enable users to make purchases on their platforms. As such, these companies hold considerable power and can influence what products, regardless of their legality, and that's the super important part here, are bought, sold, or published, right? Regardless of their legality. That's what you need to take away from this video, if nothing else, is that we aren't specifically talking about things that your government or mine has determined are unacceptable for society to experience. We're talking about the things that the society has allowed that now Visa and Mastercard and whoever's running them on any given day have determined are beyond the pale for them to move money between one bank and another in order for you to purchase that good from the good provider that wants to sell it to you, and legally so. This article continues for more of the summary, but I wanted to give that 30,000-foot overview because, as we talked about in our prior video, I think this is patently unacceptable for any Western democracy to allow for these kind of corporations to get in the way of what is freedom of expression, both on the sell side and the purchasing side. And in the interim between that video and this one, Mastercard also felt it necessary to talk about this a bit. So they put out a statement on their social media platforms that says, clarifying recent headlines on gaming content. Mastercard has not evaluated any game or required restrictions of any activity on game creator sites and platforms, contrary to media reports and allegations. Our payment network follows standards based on the rule of law. Put simply, we allow all lawful purchases on our network. At the same time, we require merchants to have appropriate controls to ensure Mastercard cards cannot be used for unlawful purchases, including illegal adult content. Now, there's a lot there. We're going to unpack it. That's what the purpose of this video is. But suffice it to say, the very first thing I would note here as a corporate lawyer is that no one should read this and assume that Mastercard or companies that make statements like this are lying. These companies don't lie on their face. They don't say something that is patently untrue because their lawyers in general won't allow it. Now, there are exceptions to every rule, just like this one, but for the most part, you can rest assured when you read a statement like this that this is not a lie insofar as it is specifically making a false statement. In fact, it's more of a technical omission. You can read between the lines. We're going to talk about that process as part of this conversation. But the way I talk about it to my clients and to my friends and family is to think of the cookie jar, right? If you've got a toddler or a youngster in your house and they are mysteriously missing cookies, and they say, and you go to them and you say, all right, did you take a cookie out of the cookie jar? And they say, no, absolutely not. I would never put my hand in the cookie jar. Then you look at that statement and you say, all right, did you tip over the cookie jar and take the cookies off the counter? And they might well tell you the truth at that point. But you can see the difference between an actual lie and a technical lie whenever you talk to any toddlers or young people in your life. This is the way you should treat corporate statements. Remember the cookie jar. Think of the fact that you can tell a lot of technical truths without telling the complete and absolute truth, and that for the most part, the law can't do much about it in those specific situations because we don't want to outlaw any possible kind of omission or elision of what the truth behind what you're asking about actually is, because we don't want the governments of the world to be in there policing speech, which is exactly what this topic is entirely about in the first instance. So remember the cookie jar. But if we remember the cookie jar when we read this, we'll note a couple of things. One, that Mastercard only really says that we didn't specifically go in and evaluate the games that are available on itch or on Steam, right? And no right-thinking person would expect this absolutely huge multinational corporation to go in and check out the incest games on Steam to determine whether or not they were something they wanted their brand associated with. No, that's not how this works. So they really didn't say anything in the first part of this statement. Then the second part is a little bit closer to maybe the lie line, as we will see in a minute, but still doesn't actually say what they want you to read it as saying. So they say our payment network follows standards based on the rule of law. Totally fine, totally fair. We would expect any corporation to basically say, at least in their documentation, that they intend to follow the law. I would note here as a lawyer that they don't actually say that their network only requires following the law or following the law of the jurisdiction in which the payments are being processed. It says that we have standards, which are already not laws. They're something else. They're rules, they're policies, they're procedures. And those don't reflect the rule of law. Those don't exactly follow the rule of law. They are based on the rule of law. Anyone that has ever watched a movie that is based on their favorite book or real life story knows that there's a lot of leeway between is the actual story and what is based on that story, right? So the rule of law says we don't like murder, we don't like rape, we don't like incest. Those are actual laws in the various jurisdictions. We tend to take a different tact in governments that have free expression on whether or not you can actually include those things in your fictionalized stories or other media content. So you could still say we are outlawing all depictions of murder, all depictions of rape, all depictions of incest, and state pretty truthfully that that's based on concepts of the law. We are outlawing depictions of things that are otherwise outlawed, but it isn't actually reflective of the rule of law, because freedom of expression demands that we can allow certainly artistic expressions, but maybe even not artistic expressions of those things that are otherwise illegal in the jurisdictions we're talking about. Now, if that's all too complicated to understand, I don't blame you for that either. This statement from a corporation is designed to be too complicated to understand. It's designed to have you look at that sentence and say, they mean they're following the law, and say, okay, mostly, but not entirely. Put simply, we allow all lawful purchases on our network. Now, this is interesting because they do allow them because they really don't have another choice but to allow them, except that they can put pressure separate from the initial allowance to say, we don't want you to be working with these particular purveyors of goods any longer in the future. But as it stands right this second, if they are on the storefront, we'll allow that purchase. But you, Steam, you itch.io, you should really look at what you're selling in the first place. So they can say this statement that we're looking at right now while still meaning something else. At the same time, we require merchants to have appropriate controls to ensure Mastercard cards cannot be used for unlawful purchases, including illegal adult content. Now, that makes all the sense in the world, right? We just talked about the fact that we're going to follow the law if we're a multinational corporation. We're not going to lie in statements like this. The lawyers won't let us. And so all we are saying now is we didn't evaluate any of the games separately. Our network is based on the rule of law, and we require our merchants to have controls that mandate that they follow the rule of law, or else they can't use our card. Who could object to any aspect of this? However, and there's always a however if we're in virtual legality, right? This gets reported on exactly the way MasterCard intended, but not with respect to what they actually said. As we can see here from the top line item, IGN has a headline that says MasterCard denies it pressured Steam and itch.io to delist adult content. We see similar headlines throughout the entire media complex here, so I don't want to single out IGN specifically for this other than to say all of these headlines are not doing the hard work of reading the statements put out by corporations like MasterCard while remembering the cookie jar. And I know I just talked to you about the cookie jar, but journalists should already be trained in thinking about the cookie jar, right? Corporations don't want the bad news to get out there. They don't want anything that reflects negatively on them. In fact, that's part of what this story is all about. So you should go into any statement with a kind of adversarial positioning. If you're a journalist or otherwise just somebody that wants to get to the truth of the matter, if you are a critical thinker and a critical reader, you want to look at a statement like MasterCard says and say, what are they saying and what aren't they saying? Going into the process specifically trying to squash down your reading between the lines and interpreting for MasterCard what it intends, when you can only really take what it is that they actually said for the truth of the matter asserted. So if we look at this whole thing, we've got an entire video game journalism industry that just takes on its face what MasterCard said as not being very responsive to what Valve and itch.io were saying at the same time. Now that gets a little bit more interesting when Kotaku goes out there with an article very similar, and you saw it in the highlights that we just pointed out, that says MasterCard denies pressuring Steam to censor not safe for work games. And they start this article by saying MasterCard released a statement on Friday denying any responsibility for a new wave of censorship. That is not what MasterCard did. We just looked at the statement they made in its entirety. What they said were a series of statements that are somewhat adjacent to not being censorious, but don't actually say MasterCard didn't play a part. A more realistic reading of this would say, okay, you didn't evaluate the game separately, but you certainly went through the vectors that you had at your disposal, and you got a message from Collective Shout or otherwise that says they're selling stuff you wouldn't like, MasterCard, and said, okay, why don't you go see if that's in fact the case, payment processors in our network, and make sure that they aren't doing other things that are illegal. And that came back with the same effect. But Kotaku doesn't want to do that. Kotaku just says, but to be clear, MasterCard doesn't say it hasn't been involved at all. A number of paragraphs in, and certainly beyond the headline that most people are going to read, just that it's gone no further than enforcing its existing guidelines against unlawful purchases, including illegal adult content. And in fact, MasterCard didn't say that either. They just said, we have these standards that require our payment processor partners and the merchants to follow the rules that we put forth, including rules against illegality. But as we'll see in just a moment, those rules extend past illegality. In a statement to Kotaku, A spokesperson for Valve said, oh, now we're getting into it real. We've got the update from Kotaku here, and this is where the actual story changes in its entirety, and this gets reported on in various other outlets after it happens. But if you had been remembering the cookie jar, and if you had read the statement with that in mind, you would already know what Valve is about to say, which is that while Mastercard did not communicate with it directly, we wouldn't expect that from a company the size of Mastercard against a video game seller, concerns did come through payment processor and banking intermediaries. They said payment processors rejected Valve's current guidelines for moderating illegal content on Steam, citing Mastercard's Rule 5.12.7, and we will see that in just a minute. Mastercard did not communicate with Valve directly. Despite our request to do so, Valve's statement sent over email to Kotaku reads, Mastercard communicated with payment processors and their acquiring banks. Now, if you pause here and say, Rick, didn't you just tell me Mastercard is a payment processor? They are, but they're also the operator of the network of payment processors. So when we are talking about this entire subject matter, we're talking about Visa, we're talking about Mastercard, we're talking about PayPal as payment gates, as payment processors, and in the respective Mastercard and Visa, also as the operators of networks of payment processors. So this entire kind of global economic situation is more complicated, probably than it needs to be, but certainly more complicated than most people are going to spend the time learning. I don't blame you for that. What's important here is that Steam and itch.io call this entire group their payment processors because from their perspective, that's all they are. We don't really need to get into the differences there because it doesn't matter for purposes of our conversation. They say payment processors communicated this with Valve, and we replied by outlining Steam's policy since 2018 of attempting to distribute games that are legal for distribution. Look, we have a requirement in our agreement with our developers that says you're not going to put anything illegal on our site. Payment processors, say Valve, rejected this and specifically cited Mastercard's Rule 5.12.7 and risk to the Mastercard brand. More on that in just a minute. Rule 5.12.7 states a merchant must not submit to its acquirer, and this in that case would mean the payment processor that's closest to actually moving the money between Valve and the purchaser, and a customer must not submit to the interchange system any transaction that is illegal, sure, or, and this is where it gets a little bit controversial, in the sole discretion of the corporation, that's Mastercard, may damage the goodwill of the corporation or reflect negatively on the marks. Now let's break this down in legalese for you just a little bit here. The corporation is Mastercard. We talked about that. Damaging the goodwill of the corporation means, all right, you say that you can accept Visa and Mastercard on your website. And so there's a certain amount of our cachet, our intellectual property value that is now associated with the platform in which you are selling something. So we, in our license terms, can say you're not allowed to use the Mastercard name and in fact our service if you are selling something that might damage our goodwill or reflect negatively on the marks. As a lawyer, this is not that unstandard of a set of language, right? If we're talking about licensing out your intellectual property like the mark Mastercard or the little picture of the circles or the mark Visa or what have you, then in general, you have a vested interest in making sure that it isn't associated with very bad things that could otherwise hurt the value you are trying to put into your brand. That's one of the reasons why in the prior video in Virtual Legality, I talk about the fact that we want to make clear that Visa and Mastercard are not associated with what the actual sales front is selling as much as they are associated with the movement of money properly, efficiently, and correctly between buyer and seller. And we want to continue to make that clear if we care about this situation and freedom of expression, because the only hook that they can hang their hat on is that if you see Mastercard or Visa in that little payment box on Steam or on itch.io, then they have something to lose if you are buying something personally that they don't approve of. And we want to separate that out as much as possible. Now, some people did come into the comments to that video and point out that I believe it was Visa had gotten a bad judgment against them for being responsible for certain payments that had been made through their interprocessing system. I think as a part of this conversation, we want to make clear that there really shouldn't be legal liability for that. And certainly not if they are otherwise acting as a common carrier, as we talked about in the earlier video. They should only really take on liability for the sales that are made through their interprocessing systems if they're willing to take on liability for every sale everywhere, which they certainly aren't. And that could be another legal avenue to fight this particular cause of censorship if we wound up going down that road. It goes on to say the sale of a product or service, including an image which is patently offensive and lacks serious artistic value, such as, by way of example and not limitation, images of non-consensual sexual behavior, sexual exploitation of a minor, non-consensual mutilation of a person or body part, and bestiality, or any other material that the corporation deems unacceptable to sell in connection with a mark, would be a problem under this particular rule. Violations of the rule can cause major issues. So what we've got here is that Mastercard says we didn't look at the game specifically. We just enforce legality through our rules. And then by Valve's statement and by the rule itself, which we can look at here, excuse me for just a moment, we can see that they actually do quite a bit more than just fight illegality. In fact, if we look at Rule 5.12.7, we see under the headline, it's illegal or brand damaging transactions. So just by the headline alone, before reading the language here that we saw summarized in Kotaku already, we know that it's more than just illegal transactions. It has to be more, or else we wouldn't have to include a separate category in the headline. It's brand damaging transactions as well. So they say a merchant must not submit to its acquirer and a customer must not submit to the interchange system any transaction that is illegal. Really nothing controversial there. Or in the sole discretion of the corporation may damage the goodwill of the corporation or reflect negatively on the marks. And as we talked about before, that's where things get into trouble. The corporation considers any of the following activities to be in violation of this rule. The sale or offer of sale of a product or service other than in full compliance with the law. Sure. The sale of a product or service, including an image, which is patently offensive, obviously and clearly offensive, and lacks serious artistic value. Now, that's them trying to get around certain of the freedom of expression and freedom of speech kind of concerns. There are areas, even in American law, where you say if something is just obscene and has no artistic meaning, then maybe we can outlaw it. Those are older precedents for the most part, but they are on the books. Then we have the examples that Mastercard gives, such as by way of example and not limitation, meaning that this is not an exhaustive list. That's what it means legally, is that this is just examples and there could be more. We're not telling you. Images of non-consensual sexual behavior, sexual exploitation of a minor, where video games really get into trouble, non-consensual mutilation of a person or body part. Can you even imagine how many video games have the non-consensual mutilation of a person or body part? I can't. And bestiality, or any other material that the corporation deems unacceptable to sell in connection with a mark. Now, actually, even though they give that example list, and that seems to be what people are reacting to, especially with respect to mutilation, that list is not exhaustive, and the real problem is that the rest of the language of this section talks about anything else they deem unacceptable. As we mentioned in our first video, this does not have to be limited to adult content at all. What could the corporation deem unacceptable? Maybe Mastercard just winds up hating blondes at some point. Maybe Mastercard decides that what's unacceptable to them is any notion of Republican policy or Democratic policy or heck, democracy itself. If those are unacceptable, then Mastercard is reserving for its right the ability to cut off your payments. And since they are such a big corporation, since they and Visa are effectively a duopoly in the payment processing realm, then this is tremendously problematic for anybody that is out there selling anything that is remotely artistic in nature, right? So they can come in and say, well, it doesn't have artistic value, lacks serious artistic value. That's already a legal weasel term that allows them to determine what's serious artistic value or not. Patently offensive is just to them. This is just them evaluating what's happening here. And if Steam and itch.io don't fight this right now, there's really no limiting principle that prevents Mastercard or any of the other payment processors from trying to enforce this even more ruthlessly than it currently is. Now, you might also say, Rick, if that's true and nobody can tell what it is they're talking about here because the list is not exhaustive, it's anything that's offensive to them on any given day, and anything else they might deem unacceptable to sell in connection with a mark with no other legal parameters put around that concept at all, then how can anybody comply with this? And that's where you kind of get into Steam and Itch and other folks, even before this whole thing broke out, deciding on their own to take draconian steps to push down on what is probably protected speech in various of these jurisdictions because they don't want to run afoul of this line that they don't even know where it is. An acquirer that has been notified of noncompliance with this rule and that fails promptly to cause the noncompliant process to cease, or that has been notified multiple times regarding violations of this rule, is subject at the acquirer's expense and in addition to any other noncompliance assessment or other discipline or both to any one or more of the following. So again, here the acquirer is a payment processing unit of some kind that is closest to Steam or the buyer, but primarily closest to Steam in connection with this particular example. And they are being told by Mastercard that, look, if you don't take appropriate steps to make sure that you aren't facilitating the sale of things that we think are otherwise illegal or otherwise harmful to us, then we can do these various things. We can review your acquirer status. We can audit you at your sole expense, by an auditor selected by us, or we can put you on a rule on the Match Pro system. Otherwise, we can blacklist you as non-compliant with what you're doing. That's obviously a problem if you're otherwise in the payment processing business. And so Mastercard is out there swinging its sword around and otherwise telling people what to do on a premise that is no more specific than what we just outlined in 5.12.7 paragraph 2. Now, there's actually 2 paragraph 2s here, so that's not terribly easy to cite, but this isn't the tightest piece of code as written law or rule here for Mastercard, which is one of the reasons why the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, said in a paragraph, adult content is constitutionally protected speech under the First Amendment. As our complaint explains, Mastercard's vague and ambiguous policy requirements, coupled with the dangerous combination of platform overcompliance, that's Steam and Itch taking things down that they might not even have to take down, under the plausible deniability of Mastercard saying, we didn't talk to you specifically, we talked to our payment processors, and then they're going to enforce our rules as they see fit. So that overcompliance and inadequate automated tools has led to the vast censorship of this entirely lawful category of speech. You say, okay, the ACLU's on it, Rick, so why do we have to do anything here? Well, for one, this is an article from 2023. This is a number of years ago and talks about Mastercard putting this particular rule in place back in 2021. The other aspect of this that I wanted to point out for y'all is you asked me about antitrust laws, you asked me about the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission, and the ACLU pursued this course of complaint with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and I will tell you right now, as a lawyer, just like I did in the prior video, that this appears to be a losing type of argument, primarily because the antitrust laws in the United States are mostly concerned with monopolistic behavior that is designed to increase your monopoly power, is designed to kill competition or otherwise help you out in a business sense. And there's nothing here that anybody can point to that suggests that Mastercard, Visa, PayPal, or anyone else is out there trying to do this by virtue of wanting to control their marketplace more, to push down on competitors and otherwise to increase their monopoly power. So the antitrust laws are a pretty poor fit for this, and I haven't seen any movement on the complaint that the ACLU filed with the FTC in 2023 that I could find, but it wouldn't surprise me if the FTC, being an already somewhat feckless body, as we saw in Microsoft versus Activision and in the number of lawsuits they lost in the prior few years already, did not take up this particular request to fight a multinational corporation like Mastercard, or certainly didn't take it up with any level of speediness. And so the ACLU went out there with a perfectly valid complaint and a perfectly valid issue here, but probably did not direct their attention, their force, their might, their political power in the right direction. So one of the things I want to do with this video in Virtual Legality and with the prior video in Virtual Legality is to help you all think about what you can do if this is of concern to you, right? So we did this in the prior video, but what you can do here, I've divided into 3 kind of broad categories: reading, writing, and arithmetic, because I find these little kind of easy ways to think about things helpful when I'm thinking about them myself out in the field. I want to talk about reading first. Remember the cookie jar, right? Don't jump into assuming what you don't actually read on these statements. If you're a journalist, don't put headlines that suggest something is happening that isn't fully happening. Assume the corporations are at least lightly adversarial to you in what they are communicating, and that you can only take on its face exactly what they have put in the statement before you. Second, if you do that, you don't need me. You don't need me to interpret these things for you. We all have minds that can critically think about these things. And if you go back to the Mastercard statement, you can read through each sentence, remembering to read them independently and see, okay, they're trying to paint this picture that they're not asking too much of these various bodies, but what they're actually saying is we didn't do anything directly. We wouldn't have expected you to. You did it indirectly. That's what Valve admits in their statement to Kotaku. And while you say we only prevent things that are illegal, we can tell that you're saying that separate from the actual action that is happening here with respect to Steam and itch.io. And if you read it that way, and you understand that you don't need me to make videos on this, because I certainly can't cover every aspect of this or any other topic really in the law and business of video games or otherwise at this point in time, then you'll be well ahead of the pace by the time Kotaku gets its statement from Valve. You will look at those articles from IGN and other places and say, that's not quite what Mastercard said, and you will be better informed than a lot of your peers on these particular topics. Now, before we get to writing, I do want to mention that other people have flagged for me. There is a change.org petition going around about this particular issue that says, among other things, we demand that Mastercard, Visa, and their pressure partners Stop censoring legal fictional content that complies with law and platform standards. Reject influence from activist groups that promote moral panic or misrepresent fiction as harm. Be fully transparent about content restrictions and the rationale behind them. And 4, protect creators' rights to make legal adult content and ensure a fair appeals process for any penalized media. Now, I don't want to tell anybody that's watching this video or listening to it as a podcast not to do what you feel is necessary on things like this. You can sign this absolutely if you want to support something like this. But I will tell you from a practical perspective that unlike actually contacting Visa or Mastercard directly, unlike the other things that we're going to talk about in respect of what you can do on this particular issue, this seems to me to be the most unlikely to actually affect change here. The reason Mastercard makes a statement that we saw and we can analyze in Virtual Legality is because they are feeling a certain amount of social pressure from corners that are directly talking to them. You can hear reports, you can see reports all over the place that people are calling Mastercard, are calling Visa, and having these conversations with payment processors across the globe, I think, in all honesty. And that's going to be more effective than effectively signing a petition that says, we want you to stop doing this, right? You're going to need to hit them on their bottom line. And in this particular case, their bottom line is the social cost in engaging in this kind of censorship. I can't promise you that they're going to change their ways because you call them up and talk about these things. But what I can tell you is that the statement that they make doesn't exist if they don't think that there is some additional social cost to what they had already anticipated when they decided to take this course of action. Now, in terms of the writing step, you want to keep that pressure on. You want to keep those phone calls coming. You want to keep those emails going. You want to keep this topic at the top of our conversation of video games and technology in general. This is something we can't just sweep under the rug. We can't just forget about tomorrow. As often as that happens in social media and these other spaces, we need to keep our foot on the pedal and keep making sure that Mastercard, Visa, the payment processors in general know that this is unacceptable and know that if they take this step, they are going to be seen as plutarchs. They are going to be seen as oligarchs that are trying to control what people can buy, what people can think, what people can see, and that is not going to work in a modern Western democracy in 2025 and beyond. And so that at bare minimum, if they don't change their ways right now, the next time something like this comes up, they are talking in their boardrooms and they're thinking through, all right, is this going to have a social cost to us? Is this going to hurt our marks, right? Ostensibly, if what we are concerned about is the value of our intellectual property, if we're going to take a step that actually hurts the value of that intellectual property, that's something we shouldn't do. Also, you want to know what's effective from what is ineffective, right? I just talked about the petition that we saw earlier. I don't think that's an effective way to use your time or energy. I'm not going to tell anybody not to do that, just that it's not going to be as useful as actually taking the steps to put the pressure on Visa and MasterCard, and also to put the pressure on Steam and itch.io. They are the ones that are closest to this particular situation. They are the ones that have the most money to gain or to lose, and to help them understand that if they yield on this particular score, MasterCard and Visa are the ones that actually control their storefront, not them. And if this continues on in that direction, they're not going to control much of anything. Now, you can do that with keeping your money from them, as we'll talk about in arithmetic. You can do that by supporting others that are their immediate competitors, right? So I want you to keep encouraging the fight. I want you to keep supporting the fighters. The fighters here in this particular case are good old games. GOG and game publishers launched freedomtobuy.com or .games to raise awareness on censorship in gaming. They put out a number of games for free over the last couple of days, many of which you probably don't want in your libraries or to show your mom or dad, but they're doing this to fight that censorship, and you're going to want to support those things if you care about this particular circumstance, that those things will be seen, the bottom line will be seen more than the petition that says stop doing this. And so I want folks to be focused on what it is that they can do to encourage the fight, to support the actual fighters that are engaged in this. Itch.io, I know, is also examining whether they can find other payment processors that they can use outside of these networks that are trying to censor what they make available. You want to support those initiatives, whether it's with your words or with your dollars, if you care about this particular topic. And if you want to continue caring about this particular topic and want me covering it more, you can support channels like this one through Patreon memberships and super chats on our live streams, just telling people that we're having these conversations, telling your friends to come check out these conversations, or as I mentioned at the top, leaving comments to this video, because YouTube likes that and it's not going to like a lot of the terminology we used in this conversation. I wanted to get you in and out quick. of this episode. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I will catch you on the next Virtual Legality, where hopefully we're talking about something a little less existential than whether or not we can enjoy any media that we want without the permission of Visa, Mastercard, and other payment processors.
Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.